The wind howled across the frozen plains of Montana like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter taste of a winter that had come too early and stayed too long. Emma Clark stood at the single window of her cabin, one hand pressed against the cold glass, the other cradling the swell of her belly. 8 months pregnant, and she could barely remember what hope felt like. The cabin was little more than 4 walls, and a roof that leaked when it rained, situated on the edge of what used to be her grandfather's cattle ranch. Used to be? Those words tasted like ash in her mouth. 6 months ago, everything had been different. She'd had a job at the bank in town, a small apartment above the hardware store, and a man she thought loved her. Michael had promised her the world, promised her a future, promised her that their baby would want for nothing. Then the bank had downsized, cutting half its staff in a single afternoon. Emma had been one of them. Michael had left 2 weeks later, his note brief and cowardly. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." No forwarding address, no phone number, nothing. Just emptiness where a partner should have been. With nowhere else to go and her savings evaporating like morning dew under a merciless sun, Emma had remembered her grandfather's ranch. He'd died 3 years ago, leaving the property in a tangle of unpaid taxes and legal complications. Her mother had wanted nothing to do with it, had moved to Florida and refused to even discuss the place. But Emma had memories of summers spent here as a child, of riding horses through fields of wildflowers, of her grandfather's weathered hands teaching her how to rope a fence post. She'd driven out here one desperate afternoon in late autumn, found the cabin still standing, and decided it was better than nothing. Better than nothing. That had become her mantra, her prayer, her excuse for why she was living in a structure that had no running water, no electricity, and walls so thin she could hear mice scratching between the boards at night. The propane heater she'd bought second-hand sputtered and coughed, barely keeping the single room above freezing. She melted snow for water, cooked on a camping stove, and tried not to think about what would happen when the baby came. The eviction notice had arrived yesterday, hand-delivered by Sheriff Tomlin, who'd looked at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort that made her want to scream. The county was seizing the property for back taxes. She had 30 days. 30 days to come up with $18,000 or find somewhere else to go. In her condition, with no job, no family nearby, and winter closing in like a fist, she might as well have been asked to sprout wings and fly to the moon. Emma turned away from the window, blinking back tears that seemed to come more easily these days. She couldn't afford to break down. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs that was both uncomfortable and reassuring. Still alive, still fighting. She pressed her hand against the spot, whispering, "I know, little one. I know. Mama's going to figure this out. But how?" The question chased itself around her mind like a dog after its tail. She'd already tried everything. The bank wouldn't give her a loan without income or collateral. Social services had put her on waiting lists that stretched months into the future. The women's shelter in Billings was full, and besides, it was a 3-hour drive she couldn't make in her condition with her ancient truck that barely ran. Her mother had made it clear she wouldn't help, telling Emma in a voice sharp as broken glass that she'd made her bed and now had to lie in it. If you're watching this, I want you to know that your support means everything to helping share stories like Emma's. Please take just a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It truly helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories of hope and resilience. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location and the time in the comments. It's amazing to think we're all connected across different places and times, sharing this journey together. Emma moved to the makeshift kitchen area, where a camping stove sat on an old wooden crate, and began heating water for tea. The tea was terrible, Generic store brand she'd bought with food stamps, but it was warm, and it filled the hollow feeling in her stomach for a little while. She had maybe a week's worth of food left, rationing carefully. Crackers, canned soup, peanut butter that had gone a little stale. She'd stopped going into town because she couldn't bear the looks people gave her, the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by, the obvious question in everyone's eyes. What is that girl thinking? Trying to have a baby out here alone? She was thinking she had no choice. She was thinking that every day she woke up was a small victory. She was thinking that maybe, somehow, something would change. The knock came just as the water started to boil. 3 sharp raps that made Emma jump, sloshing hot water onto her hand. She gasped, set the pot down quickly, and stood frozen for a moment. No one came out here. No one. The cabin was at the end of a dirt road that was barely passable even in summer, and with the early snow, it was a nightmare of ruts and ice. Sheriff Tomlin had come in his 4-wheel drive, cursing the whole way, and made it clear he wouldn't be back until the eviction deadline if he could help it. Another knock, more insistent this time. Emma moved to the door, her heart hammering. Through the gaps in the wood she could make out a figure, broad-shouldered and tall, wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. A man. Her first instinct was fear. She was alone, pregnant, vulnerable. What if this was trouble? What if this was someone who knew she was out here with no one to help her? But something made her open the door anyway. Maybe desperation, maybe curiosity, maybe just the bone-deep loneliness of someone who hadn't spoken to another human being in days. The man, standing on her doorstep, looked as worn down by life as she felt. He was probably in his early 50s, with a face weathered by sun and wind, deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His coat was old, patched in places, and his boots were held together with duct tape. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and when he met her eyes there was a gentleness there that surprised her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough like gravel in a can. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Clayton Walker. I own the ranch about 5 miles south of here. Well, owned. They're foreclosing next week." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "I saw smoke from your chimney, and I've been driving past for weeks wondering if someone was really living out here. I wanted to check, make sure you were okay." Emma stared at him, her hand still on the door, ready to slam it shut if needed, but the man didn't look dangerous. He looked tired and sad, and like her, beaten down by circumstances beyond his control. And there was something else in his eyes. Recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be at the end of your rope. "I'm fine," she said, the automatic lie. "Thank you for checking." Clayton looked at her, then at her belly, then at the cabin behind her, and she could see him doing the math, coming to all the obvious conclusions. His face softened with something that might have been pity, but it didn't feel insulting. It felt human. "Look," he said, "I don't mean to intrude, but I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same feeling, you know? Like the whole world's forgotten. You exist. I wanted to offer help if you need it. I don't have much, but I've got a heated barn, some supplies. My wife passed 2 years ago, and I've been rattling around in that big house alone. If you need anything..." And that's when Emma did the shocking thing. Something she couldn't have explained if someone had asked her later. Something that went against every instinct of self-preservation and pride she'd built up over the months of hardship. She burst into tears right there in the doorway, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. And she reached out and grabbed this stranger's arm, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of his coat. "Please," she gasped between sobs. "Please, I need help. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. The baby's coming and I have nowhere to go and I can't do this alone anymore. I can't. I've tried so hard, but I can't." Clayton didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and put his arms around her, awkwardly at first because of her belly, but then more firmly, letting her cry against his shoulder while the wind whipped snow around them both. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just held her while she broke apart. This stranger who had knocked on her door in the middle of a Montana winter and offered the first real kindness she'd experienced in months. When Emma finally pulled back, embarrassed and shaking, Clayton was already reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a handkerchief, old and worn but clean, and handed it to her. "First thing," he said, his voice steady and calm, "is you need to get warm and get some real food in you. You can't think straight when you're cold and hungry. I've got my truck right here. Why don't you pack a bag and come back to my place for tonight? We can figure out the rest from there." Emma wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to what little independence she had left, but the baby kicked again, harder this time, and she thought about the eviction notice lying on the crate that served as her table, about the dwindling food supply, about the heater that wouldn't last much longer, about the very real possibility that she might go into labor out here alone with no way to get help. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, thank you." She threw what little she owned into a duffel bag, her hands shaking. A few changes of clothes, her grandfather's pocket watch that she'd found in the cabin's single drawer, the eviction notice because she couldn't afford to forget about it, a photograph of her mother and grandfather from happier times. It took less than 5 minutes to pack up her entire life. Clayton's truck was warm, the heater blasting, and Emma nearly wept again at the simple luxury of it. As they drove south, the road barely visible under the snow, Clayton talked in a low, soothing voice about his ranch, about how he'd been trying to keep it running after his wife died but had finally admitted defeat, about how the bank was taking it but he had a few weeks left, about how the house was too big and too empty, and how it would be nice to have company for whatever time remained. The Walker Ranch house appeared through the snow like something from a dream, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and smoke curling from the chimney. It wasn't grand, but compared to Emma's cabin, it was a palace. Clayton helped her inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical wave. The interior was worn but clean, decorated with the kind of comfortable furniture that spoke of decades of use. Photographs lined the walls, showing a younger Clayton with a pretty woman, their arms around each other smiling at the camera. "That was my Sarah," Clayton said, noticing Emma looking. "Cancer took her quick. 6 months from diagnosis to gone. I've been trying to hold on to this place for her memory, but I think she'd understand. Sometimes you have to let go." He showed Emma to a guest bedroom upstairs, a small room with a quilt-covered bed and a window that looked out over snow-covered fields, bathrooms across the hall, has hot water and everything. You take your time, get cleaned up, rest if you want. I'll make us something to eat. Emma stood in the doorway after he left, unable to move for a long moment. A real bed. Hot water. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the faucet, watching steam rise and felt tears threatening again. How had her life come to this? How had basic human necessities become luxuries she wept over? The shower was scalding and glorious. She stood under the spray until her skin turned pink, washing away days of grime and cold. When she finally emerged, she found that Clayton had left clean towels and a set of clothes that must have belonged to his wife. Soft flannel and worn, but comfortable. They were too big, but Emma didn't care. They smelled like lavender and cedar, like a home that had been loved. Downstairs, Clayton had made simple food. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. The kind of meal that would have seemed ordinary in any other context, but tasted like heaven to Emma. They ate in silence at first, the warmth of the kitchen seeping into her bones, making her realize just how cold she'd been for so long. "The eviction," Clayton finally said, nodding at the paper Emma had set on the table. 30 days on 18,000. It's a hard hole to climb out of. "Impossible," Emma said flatly. "I've looked at it from every angle. There's no way. I'll have to leave, find somewhere else, but I don't know where. Everyone keeps telling me to contact family, but my family doesn't want me. My mother made that clear, and the baby's father is gone, just gone." Clayton nodded slowly, chewing thoughtfully. "Your grandfather, what was his name?" "William Clark. Everyone called him Bill. Why?" "I knew Bill," Clayton said, and Emma's head snapped up. "Not well, but we'd see each other at the feed store, at auctions. Good man, hard worker. I was sorry when he passed. I remember hearing there was some kind of confusion about his estate. My mother said he died with nothing but debts," Emma said bitterly. "She wanted nothing to do with the place. I think she blamed him for my grandmother leaving when my mom was young. There was a lot of resentment there." Clayton was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed like he was trying to remember something. "I might be misremembering," he said slowly, "but I recall Bill talking once about some kind of investment he'd made, something he was proud of. This was years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years before he died. He said something about setting things up so his family would be taken care of, but he was cryptic about it. I figured he meant life insurance or something." Emma felt a flicker of something in her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous. But curiosity. "I've been through the whole cabin," she said. "There's nothing there, just basic furniture, some old tools, a few personal items. If he had money or investments, I don't know what happened to them." "You've been through the whole cabin?" Clayton asked. "Even the attic?" "There's no attic, it's just the one room." Clayton raised an eyebrow. "Your grandfather's cabin has an attic. I helped him repair the roof one summer. Must have been 15 years ago. There's a crawl space up there, accessed through the ceiling in the back corner. It's easy to miss if you don't know it's there." Emma stared at him, her soup forgotten. A crawl space, an attic. She'd been living in that cabin for months and never knew. What if her grandfather had stored things up there? What if there was something, anything, that could help her understand his finances? Understand what had happened to the ranch? "I need to go back," she said suddenly, starting to stand. Clayton held up a hand. "Not tonight. It's nearly dark and the roads are getting worse. Tomorrow morning, I'll drive you back. We'll take a look together. If there's something up there, we'll find it." Emma wanted to argue, but exhaustion was catching up with her. The warmth, the food, the first feeling of safety she'd had in months, all of it was pulling at her like a drug. Clayton saw it in her face. "You need rest," he said gently. "For you and the baby, one night won't make a difference. The cabin's not going anywhere." He was right. Emma let him guide her back upstairs, and when she climbed into the soft bed with its clean sheets and thick blankets, she was asleep before her head fully hit the pillow. She dreamed of her grandfather, Bill Clark, as she remembered him from childhood. Tall and strong despite his age, his hands gentle when he lifted her onto the back of a horse, his voice patient when he taught her to whistle through her fingers. In the dream, he was trying to tell her something, pointing at the cabin, at the roof, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. She woke with a start in the darkness, her heart racing, the baby shifting uncomfortably inside her. The room was black except for a sliver of moonlight through the curtains. Emma lay there, one hand on her belly, thinking about that dream, about her grandfather, about all the summers she'd spent here and how happy they'd been. Bill Clark had been a hard man in some ways, shaped by decades of ranch work and loss, but he'd loved her. She'd known that even as a child. He'd loved her mother too, even though their relationship had been complicated. What had happened to cause such a rift? Emma's mother never talked about it, deflecting any questions with sharp words and bitter silence. All Emma knew was that her grandmother had left when her mother was a teenager, running off with another man, and Bill had raised her mother alone. There'd been resentment, anger, a feeling that Bill had somehow failed, though Emma never understood the details. Her mother had left Montana the day she turned 18 and barely looked back. But Emma had come back for those summers, drawn by something she couldn't name. The wide open spaces, the smell of hay and horses, the feeling that here, under the endless sky, she could be herself. And her grandfather had welcomed her every time, teaching her about the land, about the animals, about the kind of hard work that built character. He'd never had much money, lived simply, but he'd seemed content. Had there been more to his life than Emma understood? Had there been secrets, plans, hopes he'd never shared? Morning came cold and bright. Emma woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, luxuries she'd nearly forgotten. Clayton had breakfast ready, a full spread that made her realize just how inadequately she'd been eating. He didn't hover or press her to talk, just let her eat her fill while he checked the weather report on an old radio. "Storm's supposed to hold off until tonight," he said. "We've got a window. You ready to go treasure hunting?" The drive back to the cabin was easier in daylight, though the road was still treacherous. Emma directed Clayton to pull right up to the door, and they went inside together. In the harsh morning light, the cabin looked even more pathetic than Emma remembered. She felt a flush of shame, imagining what Clayton must think. But he didn't comment on the conditions. Just looked around with a practical eye and pointed to the back corner. "There," he said. "See that board that doesn't quite match the others? That's your access." Emma looked up. Sure enough, there was a square section of the ceiling that was slightly different. The wood a shade darker, newer. How had she missed it? She'd been so focused on surviving day to day that she'd never thought to look up. Clayton dragged over the one chair in the cabin and climbed up carefully. He pressed against the board and it shifted, sliding to one side. "There's your attic," he said. "Not much more than a crawl space, like I said. You got a flashlight?" Emma handed him the small flashlight she used at night, and Clayton hauled himself up into the opening with a grunt of effort. She heard him moving around above, the sound of things being shifted. Dust filtered down through the opening. "There's some stuff up here," Clayton called down. "Old boxes. Looks like they've been here a while." He reappeared at the opening, lowering a cardboard box that was filmed with dust and spiderwebs. "Here, let's see what we've got." They spent the next hour bringing down boxes. There were 5 in total, all old, all taped shut. Emma's hands were shaking as she opened the first one. Inside were papers, files, documents in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, financial records, old tax returns, receipts for equipment purchases going back decades. "This is all so old," Emma said, her hope fading as she flipped through papers from the 1980s and 90s. Nothing recent. Nothing that explains what happened. But Clayton was focused on the second box. He'd opened it and pulled out what looked like a leather journal, the kind with a strap that wound around to keep it closed. "Emma," he said quietly, "look at this." The journal was dated from 3 years ago, the year her grandfather died. The handwriting inside was shakier than Emma remembered, evidence of age and declining health, but it was definitely Bill's. She opened it to the first page and read, "If someone is reading this, it means I'm gone and things have gotten complicated. I tried to do right by my family, but I know my relationship with my daughter was broken beyond fixing. I hope my granddaughter Emma finds this. She's the one who understood what this land meant. Everything I did for her future." Emma's eyes blurred with tears. She looked at Clayton, who nodded encouragingly. "Keep reading." The journal was part memoir, part explanation, part instruction manual. Bill Clark wrote about his life on the ranch, about the struggles of keeping a cattle operation running as costs rose and prices fell, about watching neighbors sell out to corporate interests or lose everything to the bank. He wrote about Emma's grandmother leaving, about trying to raise a daughter alone, about the mistakes he'd made. And then, about halfway through the journal, the tone changed. 5 years ago, Bill had written, "I saw the writing on the wall. The ranch wasn't profitable anymore. Hadn't been for years. I was holding on out of stubbornness and pride. I knew if I died with things as they were, there'd be nothing left but debt. So I made some decisions that might seem strange, but I had my reasons." Emma read faster, her heart beginning to pound. Bill described selling off his cattle herd in stages, quietly, to different buyers so no one would notice the operation was winding down. He described leasing out portions of his land to hunters and others to a man who wanted to run a small outfitting business for tourists. Small amounts of money, but steady. He described cutting expenses to the bone, living on almost nothing, banking every penny he could save. And then came the crucial entry, dated 18 months before his death. "Met today with Daniel Reeves, the attorney in Helena. Good man. We set up something called a land trust. It's complicated, but here's what matters. The ranch is protected. Can't be sold for debts, can't be seized by the county for back taxes. It's held in trust for Emma, to be transferred to her on her 25th birthday or in the event she needs it before then, provided certain conditions are met. Daniel has all the paperwork, he'll know what to do." Emma read the passage 3 times, not believing it. A land trust, protection from creditors, held for her. She looked up at Clayton, who was reading over her shoulder. "How old are you?" he asked. 28, Emma whispered. "And your grandfather died 3 years ago. So, this trust should have been transferred to you when you turned 25. That was 3 years ago. Why didn't this happen?" "I don't know," Emma said frantically, flipping through the rest of the journal. There must be more information. There was. Bill had written detailed instructions on the final pages, including the name and contact information for Daniel Reeves, the Helena attorney. There was also a small key taped to the inside back cover, with a note. "Safety deposit box at First National Bank, Helena. Box 247, everything you need is there." Emma held the key in her trembling hand, barely able to breathe. Was this real? Could it be real? After months of despair, could her grandfather have actually left her a way out? "We need to get to Helena," Clayton said, standing up. "Today, right now, before that storm hits." "It's 3 hours away," Emma protested. "And the roads, I don't care about the roads. This is too important. You need to talk to this attorney and get to that safety deposit box. Whatever your grandfather set up, we need to understand it before your eviction deadline." Emma wanted to argue but couldn't. He was right. This was the first real lead she'd had, the first glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could change. She grabbed her coat, her hand still shaking, and followed Clayton to his truck. The drive to Helena was tense. The weather was holding, but clouds were building on the horizon, dark and threatening. Clayton drove as fast as he dared on the snowy roads, while Emma clutched the journal in her lap, reading and rereading the entries, trying to understand everything her grandfather had written. There were references to mineral rights, to water rights, to easements and surveys. Legal language she didn't fully understand, but that seemed important. Why wouldn't my mother know about this? Emma asked at one point. If my grandfather set up a trust, wouldn't she have been informed? Maybe she was, Clayton said, and maybe she ignored it. You said yourself she wanted nothing to do with the ranch. It was possible. Emma's mother had made her feelings clear when Bill died. She'd refused to come to the funeral, refused to help with any arrangements, refused to even discuss the property. Emma had been away at college, had come home for the service, but everything had been handled by Bill's few remaining friends and neighbors. There'd been no mention of a trust, no meeting with an attorney. Just a quiet burial and then nothing. The law office of Daniel Reeves was in a modest building in downtown Helena, sandwiched between a coffee shop and an insurance agency. Emma and Clayton hurried inside, the wind picking up behind them. A receptionist looked up from her computer, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in Emma's obvious pregnancy and Clayton's worn appearance. "We need to see Daniel Reeves," Emma said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It's about an estate matter, Bill Clark." The receptionist's eyebrows rose. "Bill Clark? Oh my, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. Mr. Reeves has been trying to locate Bill's family for years. Let me get him." Years. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Emma exchanged glances with Clayton as they waited in the small lobby. Within minutes, a tall man in his 60s emerged from the back, his face showing surprise and relief in equal measure. "You're Bill Clark's granddaughter?" he asked Emma, extending his hand. "Emma, my God, we've been looking for you. Come in, come in. We have a lot to discuss." Daniel Reeves's office was cluttered with files and books, the organized chaos of someone who'd practiced law for decades. He gestured for them to sit, then pulled out a thick folder from a filing cabinet, blowing dust off the top. "I'm not even sure where to start," he said, shaking his head. "Bill Clark was my client for the last 7 years of his life. A good man, but stubborn. He set up a complex arrangement to protect his property and assets, but he insisted on doing things his own way, and I'm afraid that created some problems." "The land trust," Emma said. "I found my grandfather's journal. He wrote about it." "Yes, the trust. It was Bill's way of protecting the ranch from creditors and ensuring it would pass to you free and clear. The problem is, we needed to notify you when you turned 25, but we couldn't find you. Your mother refused to provide contact information, and our attempts to locate you through other means were unsuccessful. Where have you been?" "College in Oregon," Emma said. "Then I moved around for work. I didn't know my grandfather had set anything up. No one told me." Daniel sighed. "Bill was very specific that your mother not be involved. He believed she'd try to sell the property or sabotage the trust. He wanted everything to go directly to you. But without being able to reach you, the trust has remained in a sort of legal limbo. The property taxes haven't been paid because there's been no one authorized to access the trust funds to pay them. The county's been trying to seize the property for those back taxes, but technically they can't because the property is in trust. It's been a mess, frankly." Emma felt like she was trying to drink from a fire hose of information. "Wait, trust funds? My grandfather had money?" Daniel actually smiled. "Emma, your grandfather was a very careful man. Over the last 5 years of his life, he systematically converted his assets into liquid funds. He sold his cattle, leased portions of the land, cut his expenses to almost nothing. He also sold the mineral rights under the eastern section of his property to a natural gas company for a considerable sum. All of that money went into the trust. As of right now, the trust holds approximately $240,000. The number hit Emma like a physical blow. She couldn't speak, couldn't think. $240,000, it wasn't possible. People like her didn't have that kind of money. People in her situation didn't get rescued by inheritances from modest ranchers who'd lived in tiny cabins. Clayton put a steadying hand on her shoulder. You're saying Emma's grandfather left her $250,000 and the ranch property, and no one thought to mention this for 3 years. We tried, Daniel said defensively, but Emma was difficult to locate, and Bill's instructions were very clear about keeping everything confidential. He didn't even want the county to know about the trust because he was worried about interference. It was his way of controlling things from beyond the grave, and while I respect his intentions, I'll admit the execution has been problematic. Emma found her voice. The eviction notice. The county's trying to take the property for back taxes. $18,000. Which is exactly what I've been trying to prevent, Daniel said. The trust can pay those taxes easily. We just need to transfer the trust to your name, which I can do today, right now, with your signature on a few documents. Once that's done, you'll have full access to the funds, and we can clear the tax debt immediately. It was too much, too sudden. Emma felt dizzy, the room spinning slightly. Clayton must have noticed because he grabbed her arm more firmly. She needs water, he told Daniel, and maybe you could slow down. This is a lot for her to take in. Daniel jumped up, apologetic, and returned with a bottle of water. Emma drank it slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. The baby was moving, agitated by her stress. She pressed her hand against her belly, breathing deeply. I know this is overwhelming, Daniel said more gently. Take your time. But I do need to explain a few more things, and then we can handle the paperwork. Over the next hour, Daniel walked them through the details. The land trust was ironclad, designed by Bill with Daniel's help to be legally unbreakable. The property couldn't be taken for debts, couldn't be seized, couldn't be sold without Emma's explicit consent. The funds in the trust were specifically designated for property maintenance, taxes, and Emma's welfare. There were also documents in the safety deposit box at the bank, which Daniel said contained more personal items and instructions from Bill. The paperwork seemed endless. Emma signed document after document, her hand cramping, while Daniel explained each one. Transfer of trust, authorization to pay back taxes, new deed registration in Emma's name, bank account access forms. By the time they finished, it was mid-afternoon, and the light outside had taken on that yellowish cast that meant the storm was close. Last thing, Daniel said, handing Emma a cashier's check. This is for the back taxes, made out to the county. You can deliver this to the tax assessor's office here in Helena, or I can file it on your behalf. I'd recommend letting me handle it. They'll need to process it and issue a release, which takes time. But once this is recorded, your property is safe. Emma took the check, staring at the amount. $18,342, the number that had haunted her nightmares, now reduced to a piece of paper that would make it all go away. I also need to give you this, Daniel said, pulling a small envelope from the file. Bill left it for you with instructions that it only be opened by you, alone, after all the legal matters were settled. The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed with wax, Emma's name written across the front in her grandfather's handwriting. She held it carefully, reverently, not ready to open it yet. There's one more thing, Daniel said. The mineral rights sale I mentioned. That was a one-time payment, and it's included in the trust funds. But Bill also negotiated a lease agreement for natural gas extraction on the property. It pays quarterly royalties. Not a fortune, but enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance in perpetuity. You'll never have to worry about losing the land to tax debt again." "I don't understand how my grandfather did all this," Emma said softly. "He always seemed like he was barely scraping by." "He was," Daniel replied, "for most of his life. But in his last years he became very focused on protecting your future. He saw what was happening to family ranches all over Montana, saw people losing their heritage to banks and taxes and bad luck. He was determined that wouldn't happen to you. He lived on almost nothing, saved every penny, made smart deals. He sacrificed his own comfort so you'd have security." Tears were streaming down Emma's face now. Clayton handed her a tissue, and she wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I wish I'd known. I wish I could have told him thank you." "He knew," Daniel said kindly. "He talked about you all the time. How smart you were, how strong. He said you were like him, tough enough for this land. He believed you'd find your way back here eventually, and he wanted to make sure when you did, you'd have a foundation to build on." After leaving Daniel's office, they went straight to the bank. The safety deposit box was accessed with Bill's key and Emma's newly minted identification as the trust holder. Inside were more documents, including the original trust agreement, various surveys and property maps, and a small wooden box. Emma lifted the wooden box carefully. It was beautiful, hand-carved with an intricate pattern of mountains and horses. She recognized it immediately. Her grandfather had kept it on his dresser when she was a child, had told her it was special, but never shown her what was inside. She opened it now. Inside was a collection of photographs, some so old they were sepia-toned. Pictures of her great-grandparents, of the ranch in its early days, of cattle drives and harvest celebrations. Pictures of her grandfather as a young man, strong and smiling. Pictures of her grandmother, beautiful and bright-eyed, before whatever had happened to drive her away. And, tucked in among the photographs, pictures of Emma herself. As a baby, held by her grandfather, as a toddler, sitting on a horse far too big for her. As a child, helping to bottle feed a calf. As a teenager, the last summer she'd visited, standing with Bill in front of the cabin, both of them grinning at the camera. He'd kept these, had stored them in his most precious possession, had made sure they'd be waiting for her. At the bottom of the box was one more letter, this one unsealed. Emma unfolded it with shaking hands and read, "Emma, if you're reading this, then Daniel did his job and found you. I'm sorry I had to do things in such a complicated way, but I didn't trust anyone else to handle it. Your mother's angry at me, has been for years, and I understand why. I wasn't always a good father to her. I was too wrapped up in the ranch, too stubborn, too set in my ways. I failed her, and I failed your grandmother before that. But I don't want to fail you. This land is hard, it'll break you if you let it. But it's also beautiful and worth fighting for. I'm giving it to you not as a burden, but as a choice. If you want to sell it, that's your right. The trust allows for that. Take the money and build a different life. But if you want to stay, if you want to make this place yours, you've got the resources now to do it right. Don't make my mistakes. Ask for help when you need it. Build community. Don't let pride isolate you. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you. You were the bright spot in my later years, the reason I got up in the morning toward the end. Every penny I saved, every deal I made, I did thinking about your future. I hope it's enough. I hope it gives you the freedom to become whoever you want to be. Love always, Grandpa Bill." Emma read the letter twice, then a third time, while Clayton stood nearby, respectfully quiet. When she finally looked up, the bank was nearly closing, the sky outside dark with the approaching storm. "We should get going," Clayton said gently. "That storm's going to hit soon. But Emma shook her head. "There's one more thing I need to do." The county tax assessor's office was in a government building 2 blocks away. Emma walked there through the first scattered snowflakes, Clayton at her side, carrying the cashier's check like it was made of gold. The office was closing in 15 minutes, and the clerk behind the counter looked less than thrilled to see customers arriving so late. "I need to pay back taxes on a property," Emma said, placing the check on the counter. "The Bill Clark Ranch, Section 12, Township 7 North." The clerk's expression changed from annoyance to surprise. "The Clark property? That's been in dispute for over a year. There's a seizure order pending." "Which this payment will resolve," Emma said, more confidently than she felt. "The property is held in trust, and I'm the trustee. This payment covers all back taxes and penalties. I need a receipt and confirmation that the seizure order will be canceled." The clerk looked at the check, then at Emma, then at the check again. She typed something into her computer, her frown deepening. "This is highly irregular. I'll need to verify with my supervisor." "Fine," Emma said. "I'll wait." It took another 20 minutes and involved 3 different county employees, but eventually they processed the payment. Emma walked out with a stamped receipt and a letter confirming that the tax debt was satisfied and the property seizure had been canceled. The snowfall was heavier now, fat flakes that stuck to her hair and coat. "You did it," Clayton said as they hurried back to his truck. "You actually did it." Emma couldn't answer. She was too overwhelmed, too exhausted, too everything. She climbed into the truck's warmth and let Clayton drive them back toward home, the world outside turning white. They made it back to Clayton's ranch just as the storm hit in earnest, wind howling and snow falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Clayton got Emma inside and settled by the fireplace while he made dinner. She sat there wrapped in a blanket, staring at the flames, trying to process everything that had happened in a single day. Her life had changed completely. The eviction threat was gone. She had money, more money than she'd ever imagined having. She had property, land that had been in her family for 3 generations. She had a future that wasn't measured in how many days she could survive before running out of food. And she had questions. So many questions. That night, after Clayton had gone to bed, Emma sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope Daniel had given her, the one Bill had sealed with wax and marked for her eyes only. Inside was a shorter letter, more personal, and it made her cry all over again. "Emma, I need to tell you the truth about some things because I don't want you hearing twisted versions from others after I'm gone. Your grandmother didn't just leave because she was unhappy. She left because I was a fool. I accused her of something terrible, believed gossip from mean-spirited neighbors, and I said things I can never take back. She was innocent, and by the time I realized it, she was gone. She died 5 years ago, never forgiving me, and I don't blame her. Your mother grew up watching me destroy my marriage with suspicion and pride. She learned to not trust people, to expect the worst, to run before she could be hurt. That's on me. I tried to make it right, but some things break too badly to fix. I'm telling you this because I see the same stubborn pride in myself that I see in you. It's a family trait. Don't let it ruin your life like it ruined mine. Let people help you. Trust that good exists in the world. And if you make mistakes, admit them and try to fix them, instead of digging in deeper. The rancher who helped you, if anyone did, thank them properly. Good neighbors are worth more than gold, and I didn't appreciate mine until it was too late. Whatever you build on this land, build it with community, not isolation. I'm proud of you, Emma. Prouder than I know how to say. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You come from tough stock. You'll survive anything. All my love, Grandpa. Emma folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. She understood now. Understood the rift with her mother. Understood her grandfather's isolation. Understood why he'd lived alone in that tiny cabin even when he had the means for better. He'd been punishing himself, living with regret, trying in his own way to make amends by securing a future for his granddaughter. The next few days passed in a blur. The storm kept them housebound for 2 days, but Emma didn't mind. She spent the time reading through all of her grandfather's documents, understanding the property boundaries, the water rights, the various easements and agreements he'd made. She also spent time talking with Clayton, learning about his own story, his own losses and regrets. Clayton had been married to Sarah for 30 years. They'd never had children, had instead poured everything into their ranch. When Sarah got sick, Clayton had liquidated assets to pay for treatments that didn't work. The ranch had been failing for years before that, the economics of small-scale cattle ranching making it nearly impossible to compete. Now, with the bank foreclosure looming, Clayton was resigned to losing everything. "What will you do?" Emma asked him one evening as they sat by the fire. Clayton shrugged. "I've got a cousin in Idaho who says I can stay with him for a while. I'm 63, too old to start over, but too young to give up. I'll find something, I always do." Emma had been thinking about something for days, an idea that seemed crazy but also perfectly logical. She took a deep breath. "What if you didn't have to leave?" Clayton looked at her questioningly. "My grandfather's ranch," Emma said. "It's got good grazing land, but no one to work it. You've got experience and knowledge, but no land. What if we combined resources? You could run cattle on my land, and we split the profits. Or maybe we turn it into something different, something more sustainable. I don't know yet, but I do know I can't run a ranch by myself, especially with a baby coming, and you don't deserve to lose everything because of bad luck and a dying industry." Clayton stared at her for a long moment. "Emma, that's a generous offer, but I've got debts. The bank's taking everything I own. I don't have capital to contribute." "But you have knowledge," Emma pressed, "and experience, and you've already helped me more than I can repay. I'm not offering charity, I'm offering a partnership. We figure it out together. Both of us have gotten kicked around by life. Maybe it's time we stop getting knocked down and start building something new. Before you decide what happens next, I want to ask you to do something for me. For us. This story, Emma's story, it reaches people because viewers like you share it and support this channel. If you're finding hope in this, if you're rooting for Emma and Clayton, please take just 1 second and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely makes a difference. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? It's incredible to think people all over the world are sharing this moment with Emma. Your comments inspire us to keep bringing these stories to you. Clayton didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire, at his worn hands, at the photographs of Sarah on the mantel. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah always said I was too proud to ask for help. Said it would be my downfall. Maybe she was right. Maybe I've been so focused on holding on to what was that I couldn't see what could be. If you're serious about this, Emma, then yes, I'd be honored to partner with you." They shook hands, and then, because it felt right, they hugged. Two people who'd been brought together by desperation and a knock on a cabin door, now planning a future neither had imagined possible a week ago. When the storm cleared, they went together to Emma's cabin. It looked smaller and more pathetic than ever in the bright snow-reflected sunlight, but Emma saw it differently now. This was where her grandfather had lived, where he'd sacrificed comfort to build her security. This was where she'd survived her darkest months. This was where her new life had begun. They spent the day going through the cabin more thoroughly. Now that Emma knew what she was looking for, she found more of her grandfather's hidden records, tucked between floorboards and behind loose wall panels. He'd kept meticulous notes about the property, about which pastures drained poorly and which held water well, about where the best shelter was for cattle in winter, about which neighbors were trustworthy and which weren't. There was also a partial map, hand-drawn, showing something labeled Original Homestead, Foundation Remains. Emma studied it, trying to orient herself. The map showed a location about a mile north of the current cabin, up in a small valley she'd never explored. "What do you think this is?" she asked Clayton, showing him the map. He examined it, then looked at the surrounding landscape. "Your great-grandparents probably built the first house up there. It was common back then to build in a valley for shelter. They might have moved down here later when they needed to be closer to the road. Want to check it out?" The hike was difficult for Emma in her condition, the snow deep and the terrain rough, but she was determined. They followed the map, Clayton helping her over the rough spots, until they crested a rise and found themselves looking down into a small valley, sheltered on 3 sides by low hills. And there, half buried in snow and overgrown with brush, were the remains of a stone foundation. It was larger than Emma had expected, the outline of what must have been a substantial house. They made their way down to it, brushing away snow to reveal the stonework. This was a solid structure, Clayton said admiringly, kneeling to examine the foundation. "Real craftsmanship. Your great-grandfather built this to last." Emma walked the perimeter, her boots crunching in the snow, trying to imagine what it had looked like 100 years ago. A house full of life, full of hope, full of people building something in the wilderness. And now just stones slowly being reclaimed by the land. But as she walked, she noticed something. One section of the foundation was different, the stones more tightly fitted, forming what looked like a small alcove or storage space. She called Clayton over. "This looks intentional," she said, "like it was built this way for a reason." They started clearing away debris and snow. The alcove went back several feet, and at the very back, protected by the overhang of stones, was a metal box. It was rusted but intact, sealed with a lock that had long since corroded. Clayton used a rock to break the lock, and Emma pulled the box out into the light. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly deteriorated, were more documents. Deeds, surveys, marriage certificates, birth records, and something else, stock certificates. Emma carefully unfolded the certificates, the paper fragile with age. They were from a mining company, dated 1923, issued to her great-grandfather for shares purchased as an investment. She counted them, 500 shares. "Are these worth anything?" she asked Clayton. He took them carefully, examining them. "I have no idea. The company might not even exist anymore. But these are pretty elaborate certificates. If the company survived and eventually merged or was bought out, these might have value. You'd need to research it." They took everything back to Clayton's house and spent the evening researching on his computer. It took hours of searching, following one lead to another, but eventually Emma found the answer. The mining company had indeed survived. It had been bought out by a larger company in the 1950s, which had itself been absorbed by a major corporation in the 1980s. The stock shares had been converted and reconverted over the decades, splitting and merging, but they'd never been claimed. They'd just sat in corporate limbo, accumulating value, waiting for someone to come forward with the original certificates. Based on the calculations Emma could piece together from various financial websites, those 500 shares from 1923 had become, through splits and mergers and growth, approximately 16,000 shares of a company that currently traded at $32 per share. Emma did the math 3 times before she believed it. $512,000. Added to the trust money, she was suddenly worth over $750,000. She sat back from the computer, stunned. "This is insane," she whispered. "This can't be real." But it was real. Over the next week, working with Daniel Reeves and a financial advisor he recommended, Emma went through the process of claiming the shares. It required documentation, proof of heritage, verification of the original certificates, but it was all legitimate. Her great-grandfather had made a speculative investment nearly a century ago, and it had paid off beyond anything he could have imagined. With money no longer a crisis, Emma could think about the future in a way she'd never been able to before. She met with architects and contractors, discussing what it would take to restore the original homestead foundation, to build a new house on that sheltered valley site. She met with agricultural consultants about sustainable ranching practices, about diversifying income streams, about building a ranch that could thrive in the modern economy. And she met with Clayton, planning how their partnership would work. Clayton would manage the day-to-day operations of the ranch, bringing in a small herd to start, building slowly and carefully. Emma would handle the business side, the finances, the long-term planning. They'd split profits equally, and Clayton would live in the ranch house they'd build, while Emma considered what to do with the cabin. "I think I want to keep it," she told Clayton one evening. "The cabin. Restore it a little. Make it weather-tight, but keep it basically as it is. As a reminder." A reminder of what? Of how close I came to losing everything, of how my grandfather lived, of what matters when everything else is stripped away. She paused. "Maybe someday I'll tell my child about the winter I spent there, about how sometimes you have to go through the dark to find your way to the light." As her due date approached, Emma moved into one of the rooms in the Helena Hospital's maternity wing that offered long-term accommodation for high-risk pregnancies. Clayton visited every day, bringing her fresh food and news from the ranch. The land was recovering from the winter. Spring was coming. There were plans to make and dreams to build. Emma gave birth on a sunny April morning. A little girl who came into the world screaming her defiance at the cold and the bright lights and the strange sensations of being alive. Emma held her daughter and wept, remembering all the nights she'd been terrified this moment would never come and that something would go wrong, that she'd be alone. But she wasn't alone. Clayton was there, pacing in the waiting room like an anxious grandfather. Daniel Reeves sent flowers and a savings bond for the baby. Even Emma's mother called, the first time they'd spoken in over a year, and while the conversation was awkward and short, it was something. A crack in the wall. A possibility. Emma named her daughter Sarah, after Clayton's late wife, and took her home 2 days later. Home to Clayton's ranch house for now, but home eventually to the new house being built in the valley, on the foundation her great-grandparents had laid, where 4 generations of her family had struggled and survived. The first night, Emma sat in the rocking chair that had been Sarah Walker's, her own Sarah sleeping against her chest, and looked out the window at the land that now belonged to them. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow-dusted fields, and Emma could see the dark line of hills in the distance where her grandfather's cabin stood. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the desperation and fear, about the knock on the door that had changed everything, about the mysteries hidden in attics and foundations, about the way the past reached forward to save the future. What would she tell Sarah when she was old enough to understand? That life could break you but also remake you. That help came from unexpected places. That family was more than blood, it was who showed up when you needed them. That sometimes, when you thought you had nothing left, you actually had everything. You just couldn't see it yet. As spring turned to summer, the ranch came to life. Clayton's careful management brought in the first profits from cattle sales. The natural gas royalties provided steady income. Emma's investments, managed conservatively, generated enough returns to fund improvements and expansions. The new house rose in the valley, timber and stone, built to echo the original homestead but with all the modern conveniences. Solar panels on the roof, a greenhouse for year-round vegetables, space for Sarah to grow and play and learn the land. Emma hired staff, young people looking for opportunities, and trained them in the sustainable practices she'd researched. The ranch became a model for others in the area, proving that family operations could still thrive if they adapted and innovated. Clayton became something of a local celebrity, the old rancher who'd been given a second chance and made the most of it. And the cabin, Emma kept her promise. She had it repaired, the roof fixed, the walls insulated, a proper door hung. But she kept it simple, preserved it as close to how it had been as possible. Sometimes, when life got too comfortable, too easy, she'd walk down there and sit inside for a while, remembering what it felt like to have nothing, remembering the night a stranger knocked on her door and offered kindness, remembering that the distance between despair and hope was sometimes just one person choosing to reach out. 2 years after Sarah was born, Emma stood on the porch of her new house, watching her daughter take unsteady steps across the grass, chasing butterflies. Clayton was teaching Sarah to bottle feed a calf, the same way Bill Clark had taught Emma decades ago. The circle continuing, the past feeding the future. Emma's mother came to visit that summer, the first time she'd been to Montana in 40 years. The visit was tense at first, weighted with old resentments and bitter silences, but watching Sarah, Emma found it easier to forgive. Her mother had been hurt by her own mother's leaving, had watched her father destroy his marriage with suspicion and pride, and had learned all the wrong lessons about trust and love. It wasn't Emma's job to fix that, but she could choose not to pass those wounds on to another generation. On the last evening of the visit, Emma and her mother sat on the porch while Sarah slept inside, and Clayton discreetly found reasons to be elsewhere. "Your grandfather would be proud," Emma's mother said quietly, the first acknowledgement she'd made of Bill in years. "He always saw something special in you." "He saw it in you too," Emma said. "He just didn't know how to show it. I read his letters. He regretted everything with Grandma, regretted not being a better father to you. He was trying, in the end, to make up for it." Her mother was silent for a long time. "I was so angry at him for so long. I forgot how to see him any other way, and then he was gone and I couldn't take it back." She wiped at her eyes. "I don't want that to happen with you and me." "Then it won't," Emma said simply. "We choose differently. We do better." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There were too many years of hurt for that. But it was a start, and starts were what mattered. 5 years after that desperate winter, Emma stood once again at the foundation of the original homestead. But now a beautiful house stood there, full of light and warmth and life. The ranch stretched around her, thriving, sustainable, a testament to what could be built when you refuse to give up. Sarah was in kindergarten now, bright and curious and fearless in the way children who grow up loved and secure always are. She knew the story of the cabin, knew how Mama had been alone and scared, but had found her way through. Emma told her a child's version, of course, leaving out the darkest parts, but enough so that Sarah understood that hard times come to everyone, and what matters is how you face them. Clayton was slowing down, his years catching up with him, but he was happy. He'd found purpose again, had rebuilt his life in ways he'd never expected. He and Emma had become family, bonded by the hard work of building something from nothing, by the shared understanding of what it meant to be given a second chance. And on clear nights, Emma would sometimes walk down to the old cabin, let herself inside, and sit in the darkness, listening to the wind, remembering, grateful, awed by how fragile the line was between disaster and salvation, between loss and finding. She'd kept her grandfather's journal, had it carefully preserved. Sometimes she'd read entries aloud to Sarah, teaching her about the man who'd saved their future by sacrificing his present, teaching her about the importance of family, of land, of choosing carefully where you put your effort and love. The title to the property hung framed in Emma's office, a reminder of how close it had come to being lost forever. $18,000 in back taxes had nearly destroyed everything. But hidden in attics and foundations and safety deposit boxes had been the proof that someone had loved her enough to plan for her future, to sacrifice for her security, to believe she was worth fighting for. One autumn evening, when Sarah was 7, Emma received a letter from Daniel Reeves. He was retiring, closing his practice, and wanted her to know how much joy it had given him to finally complete Bill Clark's last wishes. He'd worried for years that Emma would never be found, that all of Bill's careful planning would be for nothing. But it had worked. The trust had held. The property had been saved. The legacy had been passed on. "Your grandfather was one of the good ones," Daniel had written in his spidery handwriting. "The kind of man who understood that wealth wasn't about what you had, but about what you could give to those who came after. He asked me once why I was helping him set up something so complicated, why I was spending so much time on what was, for me, a fairly small estate. I told him it was because he reminded me of my own grandfather, who'd believed that the measure of a man was what he left behind for others." Bill smiled at that and said, "Then I'm doing the right thing." He was, Emma. He truly was. Emma kept that letter with her grandfather's journal, 2 pieces of paper that told the story of how love crosses time, how sacrifice builds foundations, how planning and care and hope can reach across death to save the living. The ranch continued to grow. Emma expanded into agritourism, offering workshops on sustainable ranching, hosting school groups, creating a space where people could connect with the land. Sarah grew tall and strong, learning to ride before she could properly read, understanding animals and weather and the rhythms of the seasons in the way children who grow up on ranches always do. When Sarah turned 10, Emma took her on a special trip. They drove to the cemetery where Bill Clark was buried, a simple grave in a small plot outside town. Emma had visited many times over the years, bringing flowers, keeping the grave tended. But this was Sarah's first visit, and Emma wanted her to understand the full story. They stood together in the cool morning air, looking at the simple headstone. William Bill Clark, 1945-2022, beloved father and grandfather. He lived for those who would come after. "He never met me," Sarah said, a statement not a question. She knew the timeline, knew that her great-grandfather had died before she was born, before her mother had even met her father. "No," Emma said, "but he loved you anyway. Everything he did in those last years, he did for you. Even though he'd never hold you or hear your laugh. He believed you deserved a future, and he made sure you had one." Sarah thought about that for a while, the way children do when wrestling with big concepts. How did he know I'd be born? "He didn't," Emma said. "He didn't know if I'd ever have children, didn't know if I'd even want to keep the ranch, but he gave me the choice. He gave me the resources to choose my own path. And I chose this. I chose to build a life here, to have you, to create something that would last." They placed flowers on the grave, wild flowers Sarah had picked from the fields that morning. And as they walked back to the truck, Sarah slipped her hand into Emma's and said, "I want to be like him. I want to do things that help people I'll never meet." Emma squeezed her daughter's hand, tears pricking her eyes. "Then you will. That's how the best of people live on, not just in what they leave behind, but in who they inspire to do better." 10 years after that winter of desperation, Emma stood at a podium at a ranching conference in Billings, sharing her story with a room full of people facing their own struggles. She talked about sustainable practices, about diversifying income, about building community instead of isolating. But she also talked about hope, about not giving up, about the importance of planning for those who come after. "I was living in a cabin with no electricity, no running water, 8 months pregnant and facing eviction," she told the audience. "I thought I had nothing. I thought I was alone. I was wrong on both counts. I had a grandfather who'd loved me enough to plan for my future, and I had neighbors I'd never met who were willing to help when I needed it most." After the presentation, person after person came up to talk to her, to share their own stories of struggle and survival, to ask for advice, to simply say thank you for reminding them that hard times don't last forever. Emma listened to each one, remembering how it felt to be desperate, remembering the night Clayton Walker knocked on her door, remembering how a single act of kindness had changed everything. Clayton was in the audience that day, now in his 70s but still sharp and active. He'd become something of a father figure to Emma, a grandfather figure to Sarah, the family neither of them had known they needed. When Emma finished talking to the last audience member and came to sit beside him, he smiled. "Bill would have been proud," he said. "You've taken what he gave you and multiplied it. Now that's the best kind of inheritance." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence between them. Outside the conference center, Montana stretched in all directions, vast and beautiful and hard. Ranches dotted the landscape, some thriving, some failing, all of them fighting the same battle against economics and weather and time. But Emma knew now what she hadn't known that desperate winter. The land didn't care about your struggles. The land just was, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. What mattered was the people who worked it, who loved it, who chose to stay despite the hardships. What mattered was the connections you built, the help you offered, the legacy you left. The ranch had become Emma's legacy now, not just the physical property but what it represented. A place where people could start over. A place where sustainable practices met traditional values. A place where help was offered freely and accepted without shame. A place where the past informed the future but didn't imprison it. Sarah, now a teenager, had started talking about studying agricultural science, about bringing new ideas to the ranch, about building on what her mother and great-grandfather had created. Emma encouraged her, but also made sure she understood she had choices. The ranch would be there if she wanted it, but it didn't have to define her. That was the gift Bill had really given them. Emma understood now. Not just the land or the money, but the freedom to choose. As Emma and Clayton drove home that evening, the truck rumbling over familiar roads, Emma thought about the journey that had brought her here. About desperate prayers and answered knocks, about hidden journals and forgotten foundations, about the way love worked across generations, sometimes in ways that weren't visible until years later. She thought about the girl she'd been, standing at that cabin window, 8 months pregnant and out of options. If someone had told her then that 10 years later she'd be speaking at conferences, running a successful ranch, raising a confident daughter, partnered with a man who'd become family, she wouldn't have believed it. It would have seemed impossible, a fairy tale, something that happened to other people but never to her. But it had happened. through a combination of her grandfather's foresight, Clayton's kindness, her own determination, and more than a little luck. It had happened. The desperate girl in the cabin had become a woman with resources and confidence, and a future she'd built with her own hands. And on nights when Emma couldn't sleep, when the old fears crept back in, whispering about how quickly things could fall apart, she'd go down to the cabin and sit in the darkness. The cabin that Clayton had knocked on all those years ago. The cabin that had sheltered her at her lowest point. The cabin that now stood as a monument to survival and transformation. She'd sit there and remember that time moves in only one direction. You couldn't go back and change the past. You could only learn from it, honor it, and use it to build something better. Her grandfather had understood that, had spent his final years making sure his granddaughter would have the tools to build a future. And Emma had done it. Had taken those tools and built not just a house or a ranch, but a life. A life that honored Bill Clark's sacrifice while being entirely her own. A life that acknowledged the help she'd received while standing on her own strength. A life that was messy and complicated and beautiful and real. 15 years after that knock on the door, Emma stood at the same cabin, but this time Sarah was with her, now 17 and preparing to leave for college. They were cleaning out the last of the old items, preserving some, discarding others, making decisions about what to keep and what to let go. "Tell me again," Sarah said, holding her great-great-grandfather's stock certificates, carefully preserved in archival plastic. "Tell me how you found these." Emma told the story again, about the map, about the hike while pregnant, about the metal box hidden in the foundation stones. She'd told this story dozens of times, but it never got old, never lost its power. It was a story about hidden treasure, yes, but more importantly, it was a story about looking for answers, about not giving up, about believing that solutions existed even when you couldn't see them yet. "I want to study history," Sarah said suddenly. "Not just agricultural science. History. I want to understand how people survived hard times. I want to find the stories like yours and Grandpa Bill's and help people see that they're not alone." Emma hugged her daughter, proud beyond words. This was the real legacy. And not the land or the money, but this. A young woman who understood that stories mattered, that connection mattered, that history wasn't just about dates and dead people, but about understanding how humans persevered and adapted and survived. "Then, that's what you should do," Emma said. "Chase what calls to you. The ranch will always be here if you want it. Or maybe you'll do something completely different. Either way, you've got a foundation to build from. That's what Grandpa Bill gave us. Not a prison or an obligation, but a foundation." They finished cleaning the cabin as the sun set, golden light spilling through the windows. Emma locked the door with the old key and stood for a moment, her hand on the worn wood. So much had started here. So much had ended here. The desperate winter that had nearly broken her. The knock that had saved her. The beginning of everything that came after. 20 years after that winter, Emma sat on the porch of the house in the valley, watching the sunset paint the hills gold and pink. She was 50 now, with gray in her hair and lines on her face earned through years of hard work and harder decisions. Sarah was finishing her doctorate, studying the history of small-scale ranching in the American West, writing a dissertation that would include her family's story. Clayton had passed away 2 years earlier, at 78, dying peacefully in his sleep in the house he'd helped build. They'd buried him next to his Sarah, and Emma visited the grave regularly, telling him about the ranch, about Sarah's success, about how his kindness had rippled out in ways he'd never imagined. The ranch was thriving in ways Emma had never dreamed possible that desperate winter. It had become a teaching center, hosting workshops and internships, proving that sustainable ranching was not only possible but profitable. Emma had written a book about her experiences, and while it hadn't been a bestseller, it had found its audience, people who needed to hear that recovery was possible, that hard times didn't last forever. She'd never remarried. There'd been relationships over the years, some brief, some longer, but none that felt right enough to change the life she'd built. She was content alone, or rather, not alone because she had Sarah, had the ranch community, had friendships that had deepened over decades. She'd learned that family was what you built, not just what you were born into. Her mother had died 5 years ago, and while their relationship had never been easy, they'd made their peace. Emma had been there at the end, holding her mother's hand, and in those final days her mother had finally talked about Bill, about the wounds and resentments and the love that had been buried under years of pain. It wasn't a happy ending, exactly, but it was an honest one, and Emma had learned that sometimes that was enough. Now, as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the first stars appeared, Emma thought about the girl she'd been. 20 years felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. She could still remember the cold of that cabin, the fear that had been her constant companion, the desperate prayer that had become a knock on the door. She'd been saved by her grandfather's foresight, by a stranger's kindness, by her own stubborn refusal to give up. But more than that, she'd been saved by the web of connection that held people together, even when they didn't realize it. Bill Clark had loved her before she was born. Clayton Walker had helped her when he had no obligation to do so. Daniel Reeves had worked to fulfill a dead man's wishes. Neighbors and friends and community members had shown up when she'd needed them. That was the real treasure, Emma understood now. Not the money or the land, though those had been necessary. The real treasure was the reminder that humans, at their best, took care of each other. That kindness could be revolutionary. That hope was a choice you made every day. The cabin still stood a quarter-mile away, dark against the twilight. Emma had kept her promise to preserve it. School groups toured it now as part of educational programs about Montana history and ranching heritage. Sarah had helped install a small exhibit inside, telling the story of the winter Emma had spent there, making it real and accessible for people who'd never experienced that kind of hardship. Emma rose from her chair, her joints aching slightly, a reminder that she wasn't young anymore. But she wasn't done either. There was still work to do, still people to help, still stories to tell. She walked into her house, warm and bright and full of life, so different from that cabin that had sheltered her at her lowest point. But she never forgot that cabin, never forgot that winter, never forgot the knock that had changed everything. Because forgetting would have dishonored the gift she'd been given. Forgetting would have wasted the sacrifice her grandfather had made. Forgetting would have missed the entire point of the journey. The point was this: you survive, you fight. You accept help when it's offered, and you offer help when you can. You build something larger than yourself. You create foundations for people you'll never meet. You knock on doors when you see smoke from a chimney and someone might need help. You don't give up, even when giving up seems like the only logical choice. Emma walked to her office and pulled out her grandfather's journal, the pages now protected in archival sleeves but still accessible. She read her favorite passage, the one she turned to when times got hard or when she needed to remember her purpose. The land endures. People come and go, but the land endures. What we do here matters not because it's permanent, but because it affects what comes after. Every fence I mend, every dollar I save, every decision I make, it all ripples forward. I won't see most of those ripples, but they'll be there. That's what legacy means. Not monuments or fame, but ripples, effects that continue after you're gone, influences that shape people you'll never meet. Emma will understand this someday. I hope she'll add her own ripples to mine. Emma had added her ripples, was still adding them. The ranch, the teaching programs, the book, the story she shared whenever asked. Each one a ripple spreading out, affecting people in ways she'd never fully know. And somewhere out there, Emma believed, there were other people in their own cabins, facing their own evictions, making their own desperate prayers. Maybe her story would reach them. Maybe they'd learn that hidden in attics and foundations and safety deposit boxes could be the keys to survival. Maybe they'd learn to accept help when it came. Maybe they'd learn that the distance between disaster and salvation was sometimes just one person choosing to reach out. That was why Emma kept telling the story. Not because she wanted attention or acclaim, but because she remembered the darkness of that winter and she remembered the light of that knock on the door. And she believed that sharing the story was itself a kind of knocking, a kind of reaching out to people she'd never meet who needed to know they weren't alone. The next morning, Emma woke early as always. She made coffee, stood at her window, looking out at the land that had become her life's work and her legacy. She had meetings scheduled, decisions to make, problems to solve. The ranch didn't run itself, and there were always challenges, always obstacles, always new things to figure out. But Emma faced them without fear now. She'd learned that you could survive anything if you had a foundation to stand on, community to support you, and purpose to drive you. She'd learned that help came from unexpected places, and that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. She'd learned that legacy wasn't about what you accumulated, but about what you passed on. And most importantly, she'd learned that a single act of kindness, a knock on a door, could change everything. Could save a life. Could start a ripple that would spread for generations. So, Emma did her work, lived her life, told her story, and hoped that somewhere out there, someone heard it and took hope from it. Hoped that someone else would knock on a door when they saw smoke from a chimney. Hoped that someone else would find the hidden journals and foundation stones that would save them. Hoped that someone else would learn that no matter how dark the winter, spring would come if you could just hold on. Because it always did. Spring always came. Help always arrived. Hope always found a way. Sometimes through the most unexpected doors. Sometimes through the kindness of strangers who chose to knock when they could have just driven past. That was the story. That was the lesson. That was the legacy Bill Clark had left, Clayton Walker had honored, and Emma Clark had carried forward into a future her grandfather had never seen, but had believed in, absolutely. And on clear nights, when Emma couldn't sleep, she'd walk down to that cabin one more time. She'd let herself in, sit in the darkness, and remember. Remember the fear and the cold. Remember the knock and the kindness. Remember the journey from desperation to hope, from victim to survivor, from broken to whole. And she'd whisper into the darkness, "Thank you." Thank you to her grandfather, who'd loved her enough to sacrifice. Thank you to Clayton, who'd cared enough to knock. Thank you to the community that had supported her. Thank you to the land that had sustained her. Thank you to the baby who'd given her a reason to keep fighting. Thank you to everyone who'd been part of the story, the visible helpers and the invisible ones, the people who'd shown up and the people who'd made it possible for others to show up. Thank you. Just thank you. And then Emma would lock the cabin and walk back to her house, back to her life, back to the work of building a future that honored the past while being entirely her own. The poor rancher had knocked at the pregnant woman's tiny cabin door. She had opened it and done something shocking, She had accepted help, had let a stranger see her vulnerability, had admitted she couldn't do it alone. And in that shocking moment of acceptance and connection, everything had changed. Not immediately, not magically, but really, deeply, permanently changed. That was the story. That was the truth. That was the hope Emma carried forward and would pass on to Sarah and to everyone else who needed to hear it. You are not alone. Help exists, hope endures. Knock on doors, open doors, build foundations, pass on, legacies, create ripples, survive, fight, thrive, and never, ever forget that a single moment of connection, a knock on a door, can change everything.